Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, future educators. I am Kurt Russell Pabustan, and I will be discussing the first part of the short story, The Day the Dancers Came by Bienvenido and Santos. The second part of this report will be discussed by Ms. Cherry Di Padawan. So before we proceed and discuss my topic, let me just give you a quick background about the author, which is Bienvenido and Santos. So Bienvenido and Santos was a Filipino-American fiction and a non-fiction writer, a poet, and an essayist. He was born on March 22, 1911 and raised in Tondo, Manila. His family roots are originally from Lubao, Pampanga, Philippines. He lived in the United States for many years, where he is widely credited as pioneering Asian American writer. In 1932, he earned a BA from the University of the Philippines under the Philippine Pensionado program. Santos came to the University of Illinois for master's degree in English. Later, he studied at Harvard, Columbia, and as a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow at the University of Iowa. His first two novels were Villa Magdalena and The Volcano, published in the Philippines in 1965. Santos became an American citizen in 1976. 1 year later, the Marcos regime banned his novel about government corruption, which is entitled The Praying Man. Santos and his wife remain in San Francisco. His book Scent of Apples in 1980 was his only book to be published in the United States and won the American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation. He wrote more than a dozen books about exiles in both of his adopted countries, including the short story collections You Lovely People in 1955 and My Brother in 1960. He died on January 7, 1996. The Day the Dancers Came is a 1955 short story written by award-winning Filipino-American author Bienvenido and Santos, set in 1950s Chicago. It is a classic work of Filipino diaspora. So what do we mean when we say diaspora? Historically, the word diaspora was used to refer to mass dispersion of population from its indigenous territories, especially the dispersion of Jews. And now let us meet the characters of the short story. The first one is Filimon Acayan. Filimon Acayan is a 50-year-old Filipino, U.S. citizen, and a corporal in the U.S. Army. Phil is a representative of Filipinos living abroad. He is also self-conscious and insecure about how he looks because he described himself as an ugly old man. The next one is Antonio Batalier, also known as Tony. Phil's friend and a retired Pullman porter. Tony is a good-looking gentleman that looked younger than he really was. He is more realistic than Phil and doubtful of the dancers. Tony serves as a foil character in order to highlight and contrast Phil's characteristics. And the last one is the dancers, described as not warm or friendly, not sincere and mocking. The rejection of Phil's invitation was justifiable. Phil believed that they have been instructed not to talk to strangers. Possible that it was Phil's look that kept them away. If we are going to compare Phil's characteristics to Tony and their similarities, Phil and Tony are both Filipinos living abroad. Phil is 50 years old while Tony is older than Phil but looks younger than him. They both live in the same apartment. Phil is a former corporal in the U.S. Army while Tony is a retired Pullman porter. Phil has worked many small jobs while Tony has been bedridden, who suffers from a disease that causes his skin to peel and turn white. Both went to America for green pastures. Phil is insecure about how he looks while Tony is pleasant looking. Phil is better in dialect while Tony is better in English. Phil is excited about the dancers while Tony is apathetic about the dancers. The setting of the short story is in Chicago, USA. It is set in the United States of America where Filipinos play the principal characters in order to show contrasting cultures. Now let's proceed to the summary of the short story. Phil and Tony were both old Filipino men living in Chicago ever since the World War II ended. Phil described himself as an ugly old man and described Tony as a good-looking gentleman that looked younger than he really was. The story was basically about how a group of Philippine dancers were arriving in Chicago that day, and Phil thought that it would be an excellent idea if he took the dancers around the city, show them the sights, and invite them back to his place for some adobo and chicken relleno. For the first part of the story, Phil constantly talked about the dancers to his friend and roommate Tony. Phil and Tony have been friends pretty much ever since they moved to the US and the entire time. Tony had been suffering from a disease that frustrated many doctors, in which caused gradual peeling of all over his body. When Tony left the doctor, Phil left a little later to meet the dancers at the hotel. When he got there and saw the dancers, he completely forgot what he wanted to say and lost all the trains of thoughts. So when he finally managed to gather all his confidence, he had left to invite them to his home or to his house. They would just move away or say, "No thanks, we're too busy." Later that night, he ended up going to the show alone, since Tony hadn't yet returned from the doctor. Despite the disappointment he had earlier that day, Phil contemplated that if he would just record the show on his tape recorder, he would have the sounds with him to help him remember the dancers and the show that bring back all the memories.
When he got home, he noticed that Tony was back. Tony commented that the dancers weren't with him and that he knew they never wouldn't came home in the first place. Phil then started to listen to his tape recorder, and his failures from earlier that day no longer mattered to him because his recording had brought him a certain feeling. While he listened, Tony was yelling from his room telling him to shut his recorder off. When he asked Tony what the doctor had to say, Tony wouldn't answer. Tony then asked what the dancers were like, and Phil told him that they were really beautiful, young, and graceful.
He heard Tony let out a sigh as he looked down to the tape recorder he held in his hands. He noticed that the spools were spinning, and he finally realized that he had pressed erase. When he tried to play it back, there was nothing except for the screaming part of the finale with drums and tolling of the bell. When he looked outside, it was already morning. And that is all my report. Thank you for listening.